But thank you all for joining today on this very important topic for all of us. My name is Brianna Rice. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve on the WAIE leadership team as the social media and website coordinator. And I'm serving as a facilitator for this session today. So as you come in, please make sure to mute yourselves. Feel free to put yourselves on camera if you'd like to. The session is recorded at this time, so be conscious of that. If you have any questions that come up, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll try to address them towards the end of today's session. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters today.
Thank you, Brianna. My name is Pat Mathis. I am a practicing attorney. I am actually a college trustee at Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois. So I've been on the education side for about a dozen years. And I guess most relevant today, I am the co-founder and managing member of Title IX Solutions, LLC. We are a Title IX consulting organization, and Adrienne will give you a little more detail on that in a couple of minutes. We wanted to thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation today at the WAIE conference. We think that this is a particularly important topic to address a response to sexual harassment on international campuses, particularly as it relates to U.S. students who are studying abroad. So our first presentation, our first part of our presentation this afternoon will be by our Executive Director, Adrienne Mathis. And so Adrienne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Pat. Thank you, Brianna, and thank you all for being here today with us. As Pat mentioned, I'm the Executive Director here at Title IX Solutions. And just so you all kind of know what we do, we have a variety of services. We do training, investigations, hearings, policy consulting inside of the US, and then some international consulting as well. So we're focusing obviously on the international element today. And I'm going to kind of switch hats here because although I'm the executive director at Title IX Solutions, in 2019, I was the sexual misconduct policy consultant at Universidad San Francisco de Quito, USFQ, in Quito, Ecuador. And I thought that I would actually share my experience as a sexual misconduct policy consultant in Ecuador at this institution because I was actually hired by the International Programs Office at USFQ, and it's a direct result of an incident that occurred in 2019. And I think it was a very unique experience for me at the time, and I thought I could maybe help shed some light on at least this international school's approach to addressing and responding to sexual harassment. And then I'm going to propose some steps forward for collaborating with international institutions as a US institution when it comes to sexual harassment. So, oh, there we go. Just to set the stage, bear with me with my PowerPoint. So just to set the stage for this USFQ case study, USFQ is located in Quito, Ecuador. It has approximately 8,000 students, and over 1,000 of those students are international students, majority of whom come from the United States. USFQ also has dozens of partnerships with US institutions. It may have a partnership with your institution. In fact, 90% of all their partnerships with international schools come from US institutions. So they've spent years building up this relationship with US institutions, right? So in 2019, there was a report from a student that she was sexually assaulted while in Ecuador. Now, there's nuances to this report, right? She actually reported the incident to her own Title IX coordinator at her own US institution when she had returned, right? She reported to someone she trusted. She understood the reporting mechanisms as a US student. However, the incident itself occurred in Ecuador under the kind of supervision, so to say, of USFQ. And the accused party, Pat will call them a respondent, right? The alleged perpetrator was also a US student, but from a different US university, right? That's really common. A bunch of students from different US schools go to the same school abroad, they have a fun time, hopefully, and then they return back to their own institution. So this young woman who reported an incident of sexual assault to her home institution, what was feeling kind of lost, right? She was seeking supportive measures, counseling, some kind of leniency and deadlines for schoolwork because she was having some, experiencing trauma. But she also didn't want other students to experience this as well. And when I say this, I mean this lack of response on behalf of the international institution and, any other student who would come into contact with this alleged perpetrator. She also kind of wanted to have him face some consequences or learn about his actions. So the student reported this incident to her own institution. And honestly, as a result, there was a complete lack of coordination between the US University and USFQ. The US institution did not have a protocol for responding to international incidents or relaying that information to the international institution. And USFQ did not have specific procedures for addressing these incidents, right? So when students came, they had at the time a 1 to 2 page sexual harassment policy outlining prohibited conduct, encouraging reporting, but it kind of stopped there. And as a reminder, and you all I'm sure know this, Title IX does not apply abroad. So this international institution was not required to adhere to any of those Title IX reporting or procedural requirements. But the hitch came when this US student was very aware of her rights under Title IX and very aware of the US reporting protocols. And so she thought that USFQ would respond in the same way, but there was a huge disconnect in communication as well as procedures. And it ultimately created a disjointed and delayed response. So this case study presents us with a variety of issues, right? So this young woman, she did not understand how to report abroad. She was accustomed to responsible employees, if you're familiar with that term. So if she relayed any type of concerning incident to an employee in the US at many schools, that's kind of run up the flagpole to the Title IX office or the appropriate office. That does not happen at institutions abroad. That is not required at institutions abroad. She did not know how to officially report the incident. She could not find an online report form. She didn't know who to report to. She also didn't understand how to report to local police, and not just, yes, I can tell my international institution point of contact I want to report to the local police, but what does it actually entail? What does the legal structure in Ecuador look like? Can the police be trusted? I'm not fluent in Spanish, you might say. Do I have to give a statement? Can someone give that statement on my behalf? So there are all these questions when it came to reporting to local police. She was also unsure about reporting to her home institution. While she was abroad, what does that look like? And honestly, some of her concerns were founded, right? Because when she did report to her home institution, when she returned to someone she trusted, which is incredibly common, that home institution did not have a plan. And so that Title IX coordinator relayed this young woman's story to the study abroad office, who relayed the story to the USFQ abroad office, but it was not the right person. So then that story was then shared with another person at USFQ. And so if you're a victim, the more times you have to share your story, the more re-traumatizing it can be, right? Even if it's via email and you just know that all of these different individuals are seeing your story, can be traumatic. And that's what we ultimately want to avoid, right? Is traumatizing our students further who've already experienced an incident of sexual harassment or assault. So that lack of coordinated response from her home institution was troublesome for her. There was also a lack of transparency because on both sides, right? On behalf of USFQ and her home institution, because while abroad, she didn't understand how a complaint would be handled at either school. And that's really common. Students are concerned will they be sent home? Will they be put on leave? Will the other student who's accused be withdrawn from the program? Sometimes they're not looking for ramifications like that. Would she be forced to report an allegation to the police if she wanted it to be investigated, which is actually the case in Ecuador? And so it just grasping what the ramifications of reporting an incident while she was abroad remained unclear. And the US institutions, because they had to tell so many people about this complaint because they weren't quite sure where to go with it, there was a lack of transparency on the US institutions' part because they did not want to share with this young woman that, oh, I sent your email to 6 different people because I couldn't quite figure out where it should go. It was also really unclear to this young woman what the procedures would be. So would there be an investigation? Would there be a hearing? Like I said before, she's accustomed to the US kind of Title IX-like process. Again, this was 2019, so Title IX looked different at that stage in our lives. But it was just very unclear what due process would look like, what she could expect for herself, what the time commitment and the energy kind of invested in this process would look like. And then also what would be potential disciplinary sanctions? What could happen to this other student? Would he be expelled from the program? Would he face any sanctioning when he returned to his home school? And there was just so much kind of confusion about the process itself. And then finally, support services, or we now call them supportive measures, were not made clear to this young woman. So when she was abroad, she would have really appreciated some counseling, some distance from this accused student. So they always stayed in hotels when they traveled throughout the country to different ecosystems. So she would have found it useful to have 2 different hotels. So she wasn't necessarily on the same floor or in the same small hostel-like hotel with this young man who had assaulted her allegedly, right? But those were unclear. Those were not kind of readily or openly available to this young woman. And the burden should not be on the victim to identify how the school should support them, right? And so even when she came home, it was unclear what would be available to her since this incident did occur abroad. And many of the immediate ramifications were outside of the home institution's control, right? If she needed a rape kit, an STD test, a pregnancy test, etc. So I know it's a bit heavy, but that's just kind of a summary of all the different issues that came to the forefront of USFQ's mind when this young woman reported this incident. And ultimately, this lack of preparation and coordinated response on behalf of both institutions really delayed their response and caused the student further harm. But we don't all have to be down about this because there is good news. This situation can be prevented if you prepare and work together with your international partner institutions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Pat. That's kind of the issues, the problems associated with this case study. Pat's going to talk about sexual assault abroad in general and then dig into best practices. Pat.
Thank you, Adrienne. So I'm going to begin with just a reference to a couple of terms that I will use in this next segment. Sexual assault and sexual harassment, and sometimes we use these terms interchangeably. If you're familiar with the Title IX regulations, Title IX now references sexual harassment, which encompasses a multifaceted range of sexual misconduct, let's call it. But in our conversation today, my reference to sexual assault or sexual harassment will encompass everything from offensive language and comments to touching, to a rape or physical violence, and kind of all the permutations in between. Secondly, I will make some references to victims or complainants. Complainant is the Title IX term for victim, as most of you may be aware. And finally, I'll make some reference to respondents or assailants, and respondent is the Title IX term for an assailant or alleged perpetrator. So just to clarify a couple of definitions. So why should U.S. schools be concerned about this issue? Why is it important? And what are some of their concerns? Let's start by talking about the why. In 2017-2018 academic year, over 340,000 U.S. students studied abroad during their undergraduate career. At some point, approximately 10% of all U.S. college students during their 4 years will study abroad. At some institutions, that number ranges as high as 70% of graduates have spent at least one semester studying abroad. According to the U.S. Center of Disease Control, approximately 1 in 4 college students, female college students, will suffer some form of sexual assault during their college career. And some reports estimate that the incidence of sexual assault among students studying abroad is higher than that 25% rate. There's a lot of speculation and some research as to why that's happened. Some believe that it's this, quote, study abroad culture of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Some believe that it is a function of a lack of awareness of international cultural differences between a study abroad experience and what students are accustomed to in the United States, so that different forms of contact may be relatively common, for instance, in Latin America, as opposed to in the United States. And students may not adapt or recognize when there is risk arising from the circumstances in which they're interacting with local students or non-students within an international environment. There's interaction with students from other U.S. schools, interactions with host country students, and interaction with host country non-students. And an interesting statistic, United Educators in the 2011 through 2013 period surveyed 305 reported incidents of sexual assault, and approximately 90% of those victims knew the perpetrator. Nearly 80% of those assaults involved alcohol, and 60% of those incidents occurred on campuses. In contrast, CIEE did a survey for the 2016 through 18 period, which revealed that for students outside of the United States studied abroad, 73% of perpetrators were strangers or someone that the student met that day. And alcohol was cited as a contributing factor in only 17% of those cases. So there is a great difference in cultural, academic, social environment for students who are studying abroad versus studying here in the United States on students' home campus. And I think much of the increased risks comes from that change in environment. What else are U.S. institutions concerned about? The reporting, response, and support is often insufficient in an international school environment, as Adrienne referenced in relating the incident that happened at USF2. And this is often exacerbated by language differences, by limited host school support or contact at an international institution. The host school or country may not have developed sexual assault laws and protocols, either on campus or off campus. The distance from home school support, the U.S. school support measures that may be available to a student here in the United States, first of all, may not be available on an international campus. And secondly, the distance may make it impractical for a student to secure support services from their U.S. institution. There are questions and inconsistencies regarding reporting to the home school, and particularly whether to report an incident to the Title IX coordinator or the Title IX office, or to the study abroad or international studies office on their home campus. So there are even internal problems for many institutions. And in some countries, the police manage all reported incidents of sexual assault, and they're not even matters that can or are addressed on the university campus in a foreign country. Title IX, as Adrienne mentioned, in and of itself does not apply under the new regulations to incidents happening overseas. Some schools have very developed sexual misconduct policies, which do address incidents occurring outside of the United States. Other institutions have relatively undeveloped policies beyond those required under the Title IX regulations. And even when schools have sexual misconduct policies that address sexual assault or sexual harassment beyond the definition and coverage of the Title IX regulations, many institutions still do not have fully developed sexual misconduct policies as they relate to incidents occurring when a student is in a non-U.S. institution for a semester or an academic year. So there are lots of questions about how policies apply and how they should be applied and how they interact with the international institution. Further compounding that, there are different types, obviously, of ways that students end up abroad. Some U.S. schools have foreign campuses in Spain or France or Italy or Asia. Some institutions have partner schools where they exchange students on a regular basis. You have professor-led study abroad weeks or a month or a semester. You have programs which may be endorsed by your institution for study abroad. They're independent programs where students from your campus may end up at an institution essentially because they've applied themselves. You've had some role in their semester abroad to give them credit, but it's largely an independent process. And you have students who may simply be doing a semester of independent study or a period of independent study over summer. So all of these are permutations of the issues that students may address. So the question comes down to who's responsible on campus, off campus. And finally, U.S. schools are dealing with liability issues, increased litigation. We all know that there are lots of sexual assault and sexual harassment cases filed in the United States addressing colleges' responsibility to both complainants and respondents. There is an increased emphasis on schools protecting students. And what happens if your school endorses a program in another country or has a partnership school? How much responsibility does that put on your institution when sending students abroad to take responsibility for that endorsement? So all of these are legal issues that are percolating through the system and concerns for U.S. schools. International schools face similar concerns about student safety. It's a priority for every institution, whether it's a U.S. institution or otherwise, to protect the students who are on their campus, whether they be local or they be international students there for a semester or a year. Big concern, and particularly for international schools that do not have well-developed sexual misconduct policies, they're rapidly becoming aware of the relevance of that and the importance, particularly for students, as Adrienne alluded to, coming from a system where they have developed sexual misconduct and reporting policies. International schools are often also concerned about local laws and how they interact with incidents that occur on campus and how those local laws may limit their ability to react. They're also concerned about liability, both litigation in their home country and, if they have sufficient contact, litigation initiated here in the United States. And most people throughout the rest of the world think that the United States is filled with litigation, and they're particularly concerned about that issue. And finally, schools that have a particularly strong international studies program are concerned about the relationship with their U.S. partner schools and being able to assure those schools that their students are protected while on campus and that the international institution will be responsive to students' incidents of sexual assault that may occur on their campus. So how does a U.S. school develop a policy to address this issue? First and foremost, it's essential we believe that U.S. schools consider a policy that is specific to studying abroad. Your campus may have a well-developed sexual misconduct policy as it relates to occurrences on campus, off campus, involving students from the same institution. But expanding that policy to deal with students studying abroad is a separate exercise, in our opinion. And keep in mind, you're going to have different types of situations. You're going to have situations where you have a policy on your campus. The international school will have its own policy, perhaps, or should have. And in addition, you have a variety of situations to which the policy may apply. So you may be dealing with an incident involving 2 students from your school. You may be dealing with a situation involving a student from your institution as well as another U.S. school, or a student from your school and a local student at the host school location, or even a non-student. How do you deal with the issues of local culture factors? As I mentioned earlier, different countries have different social mores, and the interaction between students and local students and non-students may be significantly different than it might be in the United States, and what may be acceptable in another country may not be acceptable under U.S. standards. Students should be prepared before they leave the United States. You should have developed policy and reporting mechanisms, and you should also have a way to disseminate that information to those students before they leave the country, so that they're aware of reporting protocols, they're aware of the policy of your institution, they're aware of who to interact with locally, and they're aware of whom you may interact with on your home campus in the event of an incident. So, for instance, an international institution may have an ombudsman appointed, much like a Title IX coordinator, to receive these reports. It may be someone in their international studies department, maybe a faculty member or a staff member. But just as importantly, who do those students contact on their home campus? Is it the study abroad office? Is it the Title IX office? And how do those offices interact? If a student contacts your study abroad office, are they primarily responsible for contacting the local institution in the offshore country, or does the matter get referred to your Title IX office, where the investigation process and supported measures may be handled? And I suggest that it's important that those offices and others that may be involved on campus have a clear understanding, and actually a memorandum of understanding, or some type of memorandum that clearly lays out, when an incident is reported, how does that information get reported on to the appropriate person on your campus, and how do they respond and manage that incident going forward. Your policy should address supportive measures that are available to students when they're abroad and when they return. The policy should address how investigations may be handled, either by your school or the host institution overseas. And finally, what type of process may occur through a hearing and sanctions. And again, this may depend upon whether you're dealing with 2 students from your school, or how do you involve another school. If your student is a complainant and the other school's institution is the alleged respondent, and they're both on an international campus, effectively you have 3 institutions involved in that particular case. And how is there an interaction, a coordinated interaction between those institutions going forward to address that incident? Takes some effort. International schools. Adrienne's going to talk in a moment about how USFQ addressed this issue and developed policy. From your perspective as a home school, understand that if you have a partnership with an international institution, recognize and understand their sexual misconduct policy, understand the integration with your policy, understand the reporting protocols and who is going to receive the report and how that individual is going to interact with your institution, so that if a student reports an incident to a designated ombudsman on the host school campus in France, how is that ombudsman going to relate that information on his or her campus? But just as importantly, how is that information regarding that incident going to be related to your school, and who at your institution is going to be responsible for managing that case going forward, both with the international institution as well as your student who may still be on their campus or may have come back to the United States, and in which case your school is going to be managing supportive measures perhaps on campus back in the US rather than supportive measures overseas. Understand local laws and how they affect that school's sexual misconduct policy, understand how the investigation process would work and how your two schools may be integrated in conducting an investigation. Adrienne will probably tell you, but we actually had a US investigator go to Ecuador to conduct an investigation on behalf of the USFQ, but also in conjunction with the US institution to gather information regarding the incident for both schools. And finally, what type of hearing and sanction process is in place on a foreign campus? If you're in a country or dealing with a country where it's strictly a police matter, there may be no ability for a school to conduct an investigation, a hearing, and impose sanctions. But again, what type of supportive measures are in place then for your students? So how do schools coordinate? You're obviously not going to be able to do this with every institution where you may have schools or you may have students off of your campus overseas if you have one or two there. But if you have an established relationship, we suggest that you have a memorandum of understanding between the schools as to how these policies will work and how they'll be integrated. Have designated liaisons at each institution, and perhaps you have two. You have a liaison at each institution who's responsible for developing and integrating the policies, and at the same time, you have designated liaisons who deal with an incident that may happen overseas to ensure that there's a contact regarding each individual case. Have clear policies. Have established communications between your schools, whether it be the study abroad office or the Title IX office and the host school in the other country. Have clear communication with your students so they understand the process and they understand the reporting process. Have clearly integrated supportive measures so that supportive measures are available to students affected by these cases, whether it be a complainant or a respondent, both on the international campus as well as back on the US campus. Have a clear arrangement as to information sharing regarding an incident and perhaps the investigation process and the hearing process and sanctions so that there's a clear integration between the schools. And finally, consider outlining for yourself and your institution the expectations that you have of those international schools in developing their own processes and their own policies so that you have almost a checklist or a template of the things that you would like to see and expect to see in their policies in order to protect your students while they're on the other school's campus, and also how they plan to work together with you in responding to these type of incidents. So a lot of work. I know this is a relatively brief presentation, but these are significant concerns for every school and every student. Thank you for your time on my part of the presentation. Adrienne, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Pat. So now that we've discussed the issues at USFQ and Pat has talked about general considerations for US and international institutions, we thought we'd finish here today by digging into how USFQ as an institution addressed this shortcoming that it had when it came to responding to instances of sexual harassment. So kind of my key involvement, obviously, as a sexual harassment, sexual misconduct policy consultant, was drafting the sexual misconduct policy for the school. So in direct response to that incident, USFQ decided as an institution that they needed to develop a more robust policy. This is a huge undertaking, right? We all know that our institutions, how much work it takes to build a policy. It's not just the International Programs Office at USFQ wants the sexual harassment policy, so we'll put it into place. It was massive because it was a policy for the entire student body. So those 8,000 national students, or 7,000 with the 1,000 international students, would all be kind of covered under this policy. It required coordination with the general counsel of the school, dean of students, board of trustees, president's office, local healthcare systems, counseling department, right? You know how huge this is. You have a Title IX department, or at least a Title IX, hopefully, policy at your institution. But USFQ saw that they needed to, one, prioritize their students, their well-being, their safety, and their overall abroad experience. And two, prioritize their partnership, right? Which it's the way that the world works, right? The US institutions have to comply with Title IX. And so there's always this kind of standard set in the US. USFQ felt, we want to be on par with Title IX. It's a unique law. So let's try to reach that kind of standard as an institution. And honestly, we need to help have a policy to ensure our partners that we can handle these incidents, right? That we are aware and that we are prepared to respond. And as a direct result of its partnerships with US institutions, USFQ drafted a sexual misconduct policy for the entire student body, right? Which is a big deal. As a US institution, recognize that you do have this advantage. Money from your institution is being invested in these outside institutions, these international institutions. And you also have the foundation of Title IX to kind of help guide you in what would be an appropriate standard when it comes to responding to sexual harassment and sexual assault abroad. Often the study abroad officers in these institutions abroad are just like you, right? They care about the student's safety. They know they need to respond, but in many cases, there's a lack of institutional understanding or support for a fully fledged sexual harassment policy, right? They have a lot of other things going on, as we all do at institutions. And so that sexual harassment policy doesn't really become a priority. But if it's partners from the US who have significant influence, especially financially, push for it, you may just kind of be the first domino in an effect that could eventually lead to the development of a policy. Obviously, it depends on the individuals who are leaders at the institution, but it's kind of a goal we can all strive for. And I personally saw it happen at USFQ, which is, in my opinion, they were really innovative and just kind of got it done, which was really impressive. So as a result of my experience there, I drafted some discussion points based on Pat's best practices and my experience at USFQ for potential kind of discussion points with your international partners, because I saw these things come to fruition at USFQ. And so when you're either selecting a partner or sending students to an institution abroad, consider these topics, right? Talk to them about an institutional sexual misconduct policy. Yes, it is a massive undertaking. Just having this conversation will not mean that they'll develop a sexual misconduct policy, although that would be really cool. But, even just share your own. What does your own policy look like? What is your favorite Title IX policy, perhaps it's not your own institution's, sexual harassment policy look like? What does it entail? How could you or other US institutions kind of support the creation of that sexual misconduct policy if appropriate, right? You may be the push their leadership needs to even get this on the radar, right? Identify steps to increase transparency. So at USFQ, there were so many conversations about how to prepare students and staff when it comes to instance of sexual harassment, right? So specifically, and I'm looking at my paper because I did so many things. There was an initial orientation, which of course took place in country. It covered so many different topics. It was like 2 days. You know, in Ecuador specifically, we had to cover earthquakes and kind of natural disasters. And in that was the sexual harassment protocol, who you report to, explaining that there's differences between Title IX in the US and Ecuador's protocols, right? Making that really clear from the start. There's also what they called ongoing orientation. So every month they would dig deeper into one aspect of the orientation. So there was a specific session dedicated to sexual harassment, sexual assault response protocols, excuse me. And, you know, what is it? What are the definitions? What do you do if you're in a different, you know, campus? Who do you report to, et cetera? In addition to the orientation, USFQ took additional steps, I guess I should say, to increase transparency. So they hired a student wellness advisor who at the time was actually a US citizen who understood kind of the US perspective and was available for any need that these international students had at the time, whether it was with their host family, medical care, sexual harassment, their phone was stolen, right? They had this wellness advisor who was always the point person, kind of like that liaison Pat was talking about. They have a 24/7 hotline for international students' immediate needs, which is really tough on the staff, but was utilized so much in my year that I was there. They also had first responders training for their own staff. So they're not necessarily responsible employees, but how would anyone who may come in contact with an international or a domestic student respond to an incident? And some of your partner schools may already have these in place. So talk to them about it, right? Then finally, I just have, you know, note potential reporting and response challenges. USFQ has a campus in the Amazon and the Galapagos Islands. There's no Wi-Fi or cell service. How would you handle that? Understand that there's local context and nuances, language barriers, cultural norms that would be considered when applying any of these shifts toward a better or more improved, I guess, response to sexual harassment. And then, of course, clarify your obligations under Title IX, the Clery Act. And just stepping back, think long-term, right? You may not make a change at your partner institution immediately, but having these conversations gets the ball rolling, and you can draft a long-term plan together. I think we're right on time. Is that right, Brandon? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for your time today. I know it's a bit of a heavy topic, but we've seen kind of the pitfalls and the successes in real time at these universities. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to contact Pat or myself to discuss this in greater detail.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.